Well, hello guys. So, I am going to be debunking another atheist video today. Like I said before, I think this is going to be something I'm going to do more often. 'Cause, I mean, there's so many junk, like, atheist videos out there that are just, like, so easy to debunk. I just never done it in the past because it's just, like, not even worth the time to make a video. But I think these live streams, um, are something that I can invest some time into. So, one thing I did want to mention though, so I don't know how many of you. I think I actually have more followers on Twitter than on YouTube, which is partly probably due to Elon Musk changing the algorithm. But I do want to mention that I recently was suspended, and here's the reason why. Uh, Basically, just saying the you know the basic uh, church position against homosexuality. I was talking about it in relation to contraceptive, uh, sex, and saying that homosexuality is worse. Somehow, apparently, that's hateful. I mean, I don't really care that much personally, but it does kind of tell us. I think we were kind of numb to it at this point, but it kind of tells us the kind of society we're living in. Maybe Elon Musk will change it eventually. I did see that he still has uh, dead naming and misgendering under breaking the rules. So, kind of disappointing it's still there because basically it's it's still supporting the anti-free speech stuff that we had an issue with. Like the main issue was around misgendering and dead naming, and I think homosexuality is the other big issue. For some, I think a lot of conservatives are starting to drop this issue now, which is not a good thing, in favor of the whole misgendering thing, because that one's more easy to defend, right? It's more easy to defend the idea that, oh well, men and women are different, like you can't just switch your sex, right? And so they're defending that now instead of anti-homosexuality. um yeah, I don't think that's a good move. I think we need to stand strong on this position as well. um and I will be back on Twitter in like 3 hours or something, so I'm not like suspended forever. But anyway, with that said, I do want to go on to the video that we're responding to today. This is off the cuff, but I think it should be pretty easy to reply to. So let's go ahead and go to it.
This video is kindly sponsored by Surfshark.
Why did God create us? We're going to answer that question.
But are you? Are you really? Or are you going to answer this question just as you answer the question of why God won't heal amputees, which is to say, not answer it? Well, let's find out, shall we? If Got Questions has got answers.
You can also discover more on gotquestions.org. The short answer to the question, why did God create us, is for his pleasure.
All right, since Got Questions has given us the short answer up front, let me give you the short question and its concerns.
Okay, before he does that, I do want to mention I don't necessarily 100% agree with Got Questions. Say that God created us for his pleasure. It makes it sound like they're saying is that God is gaining something out of God creating us, which is not possible since God is unchanging, right? It also makes it sound like he has some kind of passions, which is also not possible because that would require him to change. They do clarify later on, and we'll see that later in the video, that God doesn't actually gain anything. But I don't think that talking about it in this way is the best way to talk about it, and I'll get more into that in a minute. Let's continue with this.
Up front. If we were to ask a follower of the gods of Olympus why their gods created us, so why Prometheus created us from clay and Athena breathed life into that clay, any answer would have to take into account the alleged attributes and characteristics of the gods. And since the Olympian gods are very human in their appetite, the question isn't all that pressing. There's no tension between the gods' attributes and them creating. A Greek apologist could simply say, the gods created us because they wanted servants, or because they were bored, or indeed, the apologist could simply say, we don't know, and there's no tension. But when this question is asked in relation to the God of Abraham, there is significant tension.
God and God alone has aseity. God and God alone exists by his own power.
Because upon taking into account God's alleged attributes and characteristics, and especially his aseity, that is, his quality or state of being absolutely independent, it becomes obvious that the answer can't be that he wanted to create people for, well, any reason. Because per his absolute self-sufficiency and independence, he can't want for anything. Stated otherwise, to assign a motive to God, any motive, is to compromise his aseity. And this is just where the tension begins. Once we consider the other attributes that are assigned to God, such as his omnibenevolence, the issue is compounded. If God is all-loving, then he's not going to want to create a situation in which sentient beings suffer, is he? Now, one might respond that so long as creating us has a net positive on overall well-being, then it's justified. But this too compounds the issue, as it presupposes that an all-loving God would use some of us as a mere means to an end, making God, as James Fodor has put it, a gigachad consequentialist. And if we consider some of the most upheld doctrines, such as the doctrine of eternal torment in hell, then the compounded situation becomes utterly absurd. For under this rubric, God would have known, per his omnipotence, that the vast majority of his children would end up in hell suffering eternally, and yet he still decided to actualize such a ghastly situation despite also being omnibenevolent. So, as I trust I've made clear, the answer to the question of why God created us, or indeed anything, is going to have to account for, among other considerations, God's aseity, omnibenevolence, omnipotence, and the many doctrines derived from Scripture.
All right, so the first point, so he makes basically 2 points here. The first point is going to be with respect to this idea that God cannot have any reasons for acting because he cannot want for anything, like in the sense that he can't lack anything that he wants to gain. I feel like this is a really selfish way of looking, a really egotistical way of looking at things, as if people only ever act for something if they want something, if they're trying to get something out of it, right? Whereas I'm going to see this more as a free act of love, where God is freely willing us to exist without any gain on his part. Sort of like how you might say, a mother unconditionally loves her child, right? There's not necessarily anything that's gained from that relationship, and yet she mothers ought to love their children, and this is a kind of unconditional love, right? But that still leaves open a problem, and the problem is, okay, well, it has to do with the motive. And so the issue is going to be, or the reason for creating, which is going to be the same thing. So if you have, let me go to this whiteboard actually, and kind of talk about how willing works for human beings. So for human beings, you're going to have the will, and let me just change this, right? And the will's going to have an intention or a motive or a reason for acting, which is what we call the end, right? And so that might be something like, trying to get a job, right? And in trying to get this end, so the end is actually what, first of all, what this is important as well. The end is going to be what is good, or what perfects the thing, or where the goodness of the thing comes from. So so let's say, for example, just to make this clear, let's say in order to get this end of getting a job, right, you have to study for a test and pass a test, right? Now, I mean, if you've ever studied before, you know that you can put way too much focus on studying for a particular test, and that'll compromise your ability to pass another test, right? And so the amount of time that you study is going to be good only insofar as it helps you pass or get your degree overall. So if you have a chemistry exam, for example, and you study completely on chemistry, and you forget to study for your calculus exam, right? You fail your calculus exam, and you pass your chemistry exam. Well, that's not going to be good, right? It's not good because it's not going to allow you to get to your end. And your end is going to be getting a job. I guess I can write that down here. Right? Or, yeah, getting a job inside the field. So the means to the ends are always dependent on the end for the goodness of the thing. I mentioned that, and I'll explain why I mentioned that later. Okay, so the end is the motive. There's means to the end, such as studying. Now, whenever it comes to God, right, we don't want to say that his motive is something like a job or any kind of creature. And the reason for that is because the end is, in a way, a reason or a cause for the action, right? So when we go to school and we try to study, we're doing that because of the end of getting a job, right? If that were God's motive, then it would seem that something is moving or causing God to act. That's impossible, and it would also mean that in order that the end is the good that you're seeking, and so in a way that end also perfects you, and it also brings you to your completion, to it fulfills you, right? It perfects your will. If God had some sort of creature as his end, as his motive for acting, it would be also what perfects his will. So we can't have it for two reasons. We can't have creatures be the end of God for two reasons. One, because it's going to perfect his will, and two, because it'll be a cause of his action, and God is the uncaused cause, right? He's the first cause. And yeah, and so if a creature were the cause of God's willing, the creature would be the cause of God's willing, and God would not be the first cause. So there is another possibility, though. Instead of studying and job, so we can have the end of God's willing simply be God himself, right? If the end of God's willing is himself, then you don't have the same problem, right? You don't need creatures to perfect yourself. You have yourself. God has himself simply in virtue of being God. And so we want God to be, in order for God to be logically coherent, God has to be his end. And also, I mean, you can talk about God being the motive for his own action. The motive for his own action is himself, which is not a problem because, yeah, God is the first cause. God is the reason for him acting. It's simply due to his nature. And so this is ultimately how we get around all of his problems, is by saying that God is the end of his own act of willing. And the reason why God is creating creatures is for the sake of his own, for the sake of himself. And it's not that God gains anything from creating creatures, right? Creatures are sort of more like, they're not really a means to the ends, because God has himself. He doesn't need to go through creatures to get himself, right? But he does. The reason he's willing creatures is because he loves himself. And this will become more clear when you realize that God is existence itself, subsistent existence himself, right? And he's complete and holy existence, right? And so he's going to be able to, in desiring creatures, what he's doing is he's desiring himself, because creatures have existence in a limited, participated way. So that's why God can be the motive for him acting to create creatures, because in creatures he sees a limited participation of himself within himself. And so the reason for God acting to create creatures is because he loves himself. So I think that basically answers the question. The only other issue is with respect to free will. And if you notice, if you go back to the example of, a job, right? And let's just change this into a job, right? And you're trying to get a job. Depending on the job, there could be multiple different classes you can take, right? If you've ever been in college, you don't have to. There's some classes that are elective. And so this is basically where free will comes from. Free will comes from the fact that there are multiple different goods that you can will and still obtain the end. So, I mean, say that you could take an English literature class, like a specialized English literature class, or you could take a philosophy class. And either way, you're going to get your end of getting a job. Well, you're going to be, in a certain sense, indifferent to, at least with respect to the end, right? You're going to be indifferent with respect to the which one you take, because it doesn't make a difference with respect to you willing the end of getting a job. Well, the same thing is going to be true of God, right? So God has himself as the end, and creatures are not in any way necessary for God to achieve his end. And so he can will or he cannot will. He can will or he cannot will creatures, and he still obtains his end because he is his end, right? And so when we're talking about God willing creatures, this is why God can will freely. He can will freely because he can, love the good that's in him, the existence, the being that's within them. But he could also refrain from doing so, because either way he has his end. And so that's why basically God has free will. That's why God can will an end without having to gain anything. Why God can have a reason for acting without it being something that he gains, like the reason is something that he wants to gain. That basically explains all of that. Now, as far as the problem of evil, which is basically his point, he was talking about how, God must have like a greater motive for allowing a bunch of people to die, and go to hell, right? So that's actually pretty easy to respond to. The reason being that the reason for God allowing people to go to hell is because the good, God is creating us so that we can obtain him as our final end, right? Basic Christian theology. But it would be unworthy of God, of us, to obtain the good unless we in some way merited it. It would be unwise for God to just give us the good without us meriting it. And furthermore, meriting the good is something which is a good that God could desire, right? By meriting, I mean acting in such a way in which we have a sort of we deserve something as a result of our actions. We sort of earn a reward in heaven, right? And so that's ultimately why God allows us to, right, to be able to choose right or wrong. Because if we're going to be allowed to earn, right, earn the ability to have perfect happiness in heaven, right, then we also have to have the ability to not earn that happiness. And it just so happens that a lot of people do not do their due diligence. They do not attempt to seek the good, and they try to seek finite pleasures on earth above God. And that leads them to not being worthy of union with God. And yeah, as far as God, is that proportionally good? Like, is it better than not? I mean, the thing is, we actually see hell as a good thing in a way. I mean, it's not good for the people, right? The people, you don't want to go to hell, right? But it's actually an ordering according to justice that evil people go to hell. Evil people are punished. And I think this is something that we shouldn't budge on. A lot of atheists are going to want us to say that, well, hell is like a necessary evil. It's something that we must produce. We must allow hell in order to have some other good. And that's not exactly right. I mean, in a sense, yeah, God allows hell because he wants people to be able to merit heaven. But it's not exactly an evil either to send bad people to hell, right? That's a good thing. That's ordering things according to justice. So yeah, that's how I put that. Let's continue with the video at this point, though.
In short, God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and absolutely independent. God can't be improved upon in any way. And so, for what reason would he have to create? Anyhow, with that, let's get back to God questions.
For himself, and again, this is going to be very egotistical, like his view, which, I mean, I'm not surprised as an atheist that he has an egotistical view. It's basically comes with the territory. But yeah, God loves us out of a free act of love. And another thing that you can mention is that St. Thomas Aquinas said that the good tends to diffuse itself. And you can see this in the fact that, like, when you really love something, when you love a topic, you want to share it with others. You're doing this right now by talking about these philosophical concepts. You do it because you love these concepts. You're sharing it freely because, I mean, I suppose you're probably making money. Some people are probably, well, Rationality Rules is making money off of this, right? But presumably he started this just freely sharing his opinions because he loves these things, not because he thought he was going to get some kind of money out of it, I would think. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's completely egotistical and selfish, but it's something that we tend to do, and it's something that God tends to do as well, that he tends to diffuse his goodness, to share it with others freely.
Now, I'm sure by now you're well aware of the many benefits of a VPN. They protect your online privacy, enable you to... So, if you want to bump up your online privacy...
Did God create us? Is for his pleasure. Revelation says you are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. Colossians reiterates that point. All things were created by him and for him. Being created for God's pleasure does not mean humanity was made to entertain God or provide him with amusement. God is a creative being, and it gives him pleasure to create. God is a personal being, and it gives him pleasure to have other beings he can have a genuine relationship with.
So you can kind of see here he's got questions is technically saying what is correct, while saying that it gives him pleasure. It's kind of not clear if they have it 100% right, but he is mentioning that God doesn't gain anything from it, which is correct. God is merely doing it out of a free act of love. I wouldn't say that God gains pleasure from it, though. So
questions have given us a lot to consider here, and we're going to break down each and every node. But notice that they fail to even explain why the question of why God would create is of concern. Indeed, they haven't even remotely given the question the floor before getting to their answer. There's been no mention of aseity, let alone any of God's other alleged attributes, and consequently, Got Questions viewers are unaware, completely unaware, of why this question is of concern. But we're going to have to put this failure to the side. Let's break down what Got Questions had to say by, well, each node at a time. They began by quoting Revelations.
Revelation says you are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being.
The presupposition in this verse is that, by virtue of creating, the Creator is worthy of praise, admiration, and indeed glory from its creation. Putting aside that this is miles away from an answer to the question, is it true? Well, consider parents. In a fundamental sense, through creatio ex materia, biological parents create their children, but does this entail that the parents are automatically worthy of praise, admiration, and glory? Judging by how most of us conduct our lives, or let's say our moral intuition, the answer is clearly no. Respect is earned, not freely given.
all right, well, this is completely and utterly false in my opinion. Most people would agree that you should respect your parents, you should love your parents. Why? Well, because they loved you enough to bring you into existence. They loved you enough to, give you life. You owe them things. And this is something I also see with respect to like patriotism. They're like, a lot of people like on the left, which I'm sure he's coming from, will say something like, oh, well, why should I be a patriot, right? Why should I love my country? I don't know if this is his view, but I see this a lot. And they'll be like, why should I do this? I could have been born in a different country. It's just kind of like chance that I was born in this country. Well, the reason why you should is because this country provided you with a place to live, with a stable place to live. And, you owe a lot to the country. You owe a lot to those who died for the country. You owe a lot to those who are organizing and making it safe for you. The same thing is true of your parents. And so when we reflect back on God, God freely gave you life. Not only that, but God, since he necessarily wills himself as the last end, when he creates creatures, he's creating them for that end. And so we tend naturally towards that end. That is what perfects us ultimately. Because that's the end that God's creating us for, right? And the end is what is good for us. And you can see this I mentioned it with respect to the jobs, right? Or going to school. The end is getting a job, and that's what perfects us. There's other examples. The end of the eye is seeing, and so what's good for an eye is seeing or facilitating seeing, right? Right. So the good for us, since God necessarily wills himself as our end, like in creating us, is God. And so we should love and worship God because he is in fact our end. And that's basically it. He is what is good. He is what makes us good. He's what perfects us. And we should, or order our will towards him. And this is metaphysically necessary because, like, again, nothing else can be the end of God's will.
Our children do not have an obligation to like us, let alone give us glory or love or respect. It's a reciprocal relationship, and
No, not true.
one that both parties maintain according to their respective autonomy. From the very get-go, then, Got Questions is predicating their case on an extremely controversial premise.
Colossians reiterates that point. All things were created by him and for him.
And this bit of scripture is arguably even more controversial, and for several reasons. Suppose that a couple created a child for themselves. That is, they brought the child into being entirely for their own glory, entirely for their own pleasure. Does that seem compatible with being loving, let alone all-loving? Well, according to many, including myself, the answer would be a resounding no. To create children exclusively for oneself is to treat children, humans, sentient beings, as a mere means to an end, and not as an end in themselves. And this contradicts the moral compass of just about everybody. When it comes to God, however, this issue is...
Okay. He is completely misunderstanding. Whenever it says it's for God, right? What it's talking about is God as the end or the purpose for creating us. God does it because he loves himself. But it's not that God gains anything from us. So that's what I think we would have an issue with. If people if people only had children so that they could be our slaves, right? Then that would be creating children for ourselves at the expense of themselves, right? It would be so that we can gain something at the expense of their good, right? That's what we have an issue with. Whenever God creates us for him, what that means is that God is freely willing the good of creatures because the end of us, our end, is God. So God is willing that we achieve our last end by willing himself or willing us for him. That's what he's doing. So he's actually not only willing his good, he's also willing our good. And so it's not this kind of selfish, like just trying to use us for some kind of end.
significantly intensified. Unlike humans, God doesn't need anything from anyone, and so even creating something for himself has to be understood in a very weird way. God can't want us because wanting something implies deficiency, and God isn't deficient in any way. He can't be improved upon. But putting aside his aseity, the more prominent concern is against his omnibenevolence.
Well, just to go back on that aseity point, it's only weird if you have this sort of egotistical view of reality where people would only ever love anybody if they got something out of it. Like that's a very dark and sick view of reality. And it's not the view that comes from Christianity. It's not the view that comes from theism. Under theism, the very foundation for us desiring or other things is God's will for himself. And we should also love others through loving God himself, which, as Christ said, until we lose ourselves, right, we cannot find ourselves, which means with respect to basically we need to lose a sort of egotistical view of ourselves and view us within the God's eye view of everything. We view what God wants, we view God's will, and that's our last end, and we're willing that. And within that, we're willing our good, because our good is within the will of God, right? And so we're willing everything within the totality of God's will. We're willing the good of all things, not just our own, not our own at the expense of everybody else's, but all things within the order that God created them for, towards him as their last end. And that ultimately ends up in us being willing the good of everybody, including ourselves, freely, without any kind of need for any kind of desire for gain for ourselves. Or at least it's not out of an exclusive desire for us. We're not the primary end here.
Considering that the vast majority of God's children are destined to be eternally tormented, since most people are not Christians, God must have an utterly phenomenal reason for creating and orchestrating such a ghastly situation.
All right, well, I mean, he already seems to be like taking some kind of Calvinist view where God is kind of like ordering evil, like people towards the end of hell. Um, that is not the Christian view. Well, that's not my view anyway. That or the Catholic view. My understanding is that Catholic view is going to be single predestination, where God predestines us towards the good, and He permits us to fall away from the good, right? So it's not as if God just chose to send a bunch of people to hell, right? Or God forces us to go to hell. That's that's one view. That's like a very particular view that not all Christians believe in. Like specifically, the Calvinists seem to believe in that position. But anyway, yeah, I think you are kind of taking the easiest position to defeat instead of um, considering the other possible explanations here.
Right? No good God would ensure the eternal anguish of billions simply for his own glory.
No, but he would do it because it's good, right? And that sounds very counterintuitive to you, perhaps because to you, hell is evil, but what from my perspective, hell is good because it's again in the order of justice. So there you go.
Right?
Being created for God's pleasure does not mean humanity was made to entertain God or provide him with amusement. God is a creative being, and it gives him pleasure to create.
Right, so Got Question's answer to the question of why did God create is because it gives him pleasure to create. And if we ask why God gets pleasure from creating, their answer is that God is a creative being. And if we ask why God is a creative being, they answer that it's because it gives him pleasure. And if we ask why it gives him pleasure, they answer it's because he's a creative being. And around we go. This is a non-answer. It has no explanatory scope.
All right. Well, I mean, maybe, obviously they're not like a deeply philosophical channel. Like they're just saying some basic stuff. But the reason why God wills himself as the end is because, I mean, that's necessary. It's metaphysically necessary that God do so, because otherwise something else would be the cause of God's actions. And, I would just say that it's, as far as like, okay, why does God even will ends in the first place? Again, I'm going to say the good is self-diffusive, and that's going to apply to being itself as well. In fact, if you think about it, the only way we know anything exists at all is because it acts on us, right? We know that stars exist because light photons, have traveled millions of light years and are now striking our eyes. That's, in a way, the stars acting on us. If they didn't do that, if the light never reached our eyes, we wouldn't actually know that they exist. And so, in a way, the existence of things is a precondition to action. It's it's what's necessary for a creature to act, and it's what's characteristic of existence. Characteristic of existence is that it shares itself with another. It shares what it is with another, right? And so, since God's essence is existence, God's characteristic action is going to be sharing himself with others. And that's manifested particularly, like essentially within the Trinity, with the Father sharing himself with the Son and with the Holy Spirit, and that sort of relationship there. But externally to the Trinity, God also can share himself with creatures by allowing them to participate inside of existence, right? Creatures are a limited participation in existence, and that's self-diffusiveness of God simply comes from the fact that that's just like how existence is, right? That's going to be the foundation. The foundation of all truth is going to have to be existence, since things are only true in virtue of being, right? They're only true in virtue of existing. And that's where we have to start. That's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with being. I'm going to start with the self-diffusiveness of being. And that's why God wills creatures, because he is existence. He's subsistent existence itself.
More importantly, though, we have to ask what pleasure, precisely, God gets from creating, because per his aseity, he can't gain anything from it. He is perfect, and the act of creating doesn't somehow make him better. What we need, then, is for God questions to clearly define pleasure in such a way that doesn't presuppose deficiency.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. I wouldn't use the word pleasure. I already mentioned that. But yeah.
God is a personal being, and it gives him pleasure to have other beings he can have a genuine relationship with.
Now, that implies that God needs genuine relationships, doesn't it? But he can't, because that would be a deficiency. He doesn't need anything. What's more, what happens to his children that simply are not convinced that he exists, because there's just essentially nowhere near enough evidence to believe in him? Oh yeah, that's right. Being all loving, that God will eternally forsake them. Makes sense.
No, this is actually a straw man. With inside of Christianity, you're not sent to hell simply because you didn't believe in God, and what you're sent to hell for is, being a bad person and failing to seek the good. Now, if you want to look this up, you can look into vincible versus invincible ignorance, right? You are not culpable for failing to discover that God exists if you did your due diligence, right? And tried to determine whether God exists or not, right? And put in the amount of effort which is reasonable for a human being in your position, your circumstances, to do, right? If you did that prerequisite research. Now, you can be culpable for failing to do the prerequisite research. So, I mean, even forget about, belief, right? If you go and rob a bank or something, or you go and take money out of the bank, it's not going to be sufficient excuse that, oh, I didn't know that I wasn't allowed to take money from the bank, right? Or if you be right, because you should be able to have that information unless you're mentally ill, in which case we do actually give you some kind of lenience, right? But if you're like a normal person, you have the ability to discover, you have that robbing banks is not okay. You can't just go in and take money out of the bank, right? And if you simply choose not to research that question, like, not that it takes much research, but if you simply choose not to find out whether or not banks are, like, you can just take money from them, perhaps because you don't want to have your fun taken away, like, right? Which this is more applies to God, right? To believe in God, like a lot of people, I feel like will just refuse to research God's existence, and they'll just go online and ask some random person, oh, prove that God exists to me, and then refuse to try to understand the argument and pretend like that's actually sufficient research into God's existence so that they can go on their merry way and disobey God's commandments. Ultimately, because they're afraid that if they did research it, they might find out that God exists, and they might have to stop doing those actions that they really, really, really like to do. And yeah, so anyway, the point is, you will not be punished for being invincibly ignorant, right? Now, you might be punished for some other reasons, but not for that reason. So, and in fact, if you read the Catechism, they do, I believe it says that it's possible for atheists to go to heaven. It's going to be based on basically whether they have an implicit belief, but I'm not going to get into that here. Let's continue.
Right? Except no, it doesn't.
Being made in the image and likeness of God, human beings have the ability to know God and therefore love him, worship him, serve him, and fellowship with him.
Yeah, and likewise, children being made in the image of their parents have the ability to love their parents, worship their parents, and fellowship with their parents. And if they don't, then they're deserving of infinite torment. Sure.
Okay, I mean, your parents are not your ultimate good. I mean, there's some kind of, like I said earlier, there is actually an analogy there, right? You should love and respect your parents. However, our parents is not God. I mean, nobody's ever going to argue that you ought to worship your parents like God, right? Why? Because God is our last end. Parents are not. God is a perfect good. Our parents are not. You know. So, I mean, this is pretty really obvious. I don't even know if he believes what he's saying here. So,
God did not create human beings because he needed them. As God, he needs nothing. In all eternity past, he felt no loneliness, so he was not looking for a friend. He loves us, but this is not the same as needing us. If we had never existed, God would still be God. The unchanging one, the I Am, was never dissatisfied with his own eternal existence.
So why, then, create? Why would an all-loving, completely self-sufficient God create a world so beset by suffering?
When he made the universe, he did what pleased himself.
But what precisely did he satisfy? What does it mean to say that creating pleased God if he's entirely satisfied?
yeah, he didn't. I mean, he did it just because he loves us. That's it. And he loves himself. He loves us through loving himself.
Got Questions is insisting that God created us for his own pleasure, but they are failing to explain what pleasure even is. Pleasure can't be what it is in every other context. We're not getting an answer here at all from Got Questions.
And since God is
Again, I think that's a fair point.
perfect, his action was perfect.
Sure, just as when God commanded the execution of little boys and the enslavement of little virgin girls, it was a perfect action. It was vibrating love, let's say. Whatever God does is perfect. Got you.
All right. Well, I mean, that's typical atheist jab. I would say, I just want to say, okay. First of all, there are multiple different ways of interpreting these verses, right? Secondly, from our perspective, again, our last end is God, right? And God, the reason we ought not murder is because it's going to be violating God's will. God can kill anybody he wants, basically, because he doesn't he can't violate his own will is ultimately the reason why, right? God can't. If the reason why we ought not murder is because it's contrary to God's will, well, then under the circumstance, or basically God cannot act contrary to his will. Like if he's willing that somebody dies, right, that cannot be contrary to his will, because by necessity it's according to his will if he wants them to die, right? So yeah, there's just basically these atheists come at this at from an emotional perspective, where they have this emotional idea about, oh well, this is wrong because I feel like it's wrong, which actually leads to really subjective and despicable morality. Right? It's subjective morality, and they just don't allow that reasoning to play out. And they just kind of act based on their personal emotions, but then you get people that don't agree with those emotions, and they do really sick and despicable things. And you can't tell them that they're wrong, because it's all based on, well, how do you feel about it? How's your personal emotions? How is your subjective view about this? Whereas on theism, we have God and his necessarily willing the good as his last end. And sure, he might allow certain evils. He might punish people. He might, command us to, in rare circumstances, right, to kill people. Well, actually, it's not even in rare circumstances, honestly, because the death penalty is a thing, self-defense is a thing, war is a thing. So, but with respect to killing innocent people, right, innocent children, that's going to be sort of a rare thing that only God could specifically command. But yeah, anyway, they just need it's just so annoying. They just come at it just assuming that their system of morality is right, and don't even consider what would it be like if they accepted our morality, what would actually be true, because they don't even understand what our morality is in any sense, because they've never studied it.
Give me a freaking break.
It was very good. Also, God did not create peers or beings equal to himself. Logically, he could not do so. If God were to create another being of equal power, intelligence, and perfection, then he would cease to be the one true God for the simple reason that there would be two gods, and that would be an impossibility. The Lord is God. Besides him, there is no other. Anything that God creates must, of necessity, be lesser than he.
So to get us back on the rails, the question is, why did God create anything? And so you might be wondering, why then are God questions answering the irrelevant question of why God didn't create us as gods? Well, join the club. What we're witnessing here is something that apologists regularly do when confronted with difficult questions. They answer questions that are within the vicinity, or at least close to the vicinity, but fail to actually grapple, much less answer, the primary question.
The thing made can never be greater than, or as great as, the one who made it.
Well, that's an interesting way of saying that Judaism is greater than Christianity, ain't it? And it's also, of course, a lovely thing to tell your child.
Recognizing the complete sovereignty and holiness of God, we are amazed that he would take man and crown him with glory and honor, and that he would condescend to call us friends. God created us for his pleasure, and so that we, as his creation, would have the pleasure of knowing him.
So I don't know if his criticism here is super, super fair, because, like, I mean, he's just trying to. Got Questions is just trying to explain why, God didn't create like a perfect world, right? Which is actually part of his question earlier. He was asking, well, why did God allow evil, right? Why did God allow imperfection? And that's what he's saying here. Like what Got Questions is saying here is that the reason is because, God could not create creatures without them being lesser than him, which is one possible approach to answering this question. And it's part of it. It's part of the reason, I mean, think about merit again, like my answer to the question, like, the reason why God allowed us free will and didn't just like create us in heaven is because he wanted us to gain merit. Well, if we were perfect and like God, we would have merit simply in virtue of being ourselves, right? Because God has everything in virtue of himself, right? And that's what it means, basically, to have merit. It's to have something in virtue of yourself. And so that's why God has to give us free will, because in order for us to gain merit, we have to earn it ourselves, which means we have to have a kind of autonomy. We're not gaining something. Well, we still are gaining something from God, but there's a kind of distinction of our actions from God, where we choose to do good, and that's that's goodness due to our free will. And in that sense, we can merit things. If we were God, we wouldn't need that, because we would just be good in virtue, or we would be good in virtue of ourselves because of our nature, because we're necessary. So, and we wouldn't derive existence from anybody else. So the imperfection, the necessity of imperfection in creation is actually very relevant.
But not if we're non-believers, right? If we're earnestly not convinced of God's existence, then it's not really a pleasure, is it? We're going to end up being eternally tormented for a crime of disbelief, despite the fact that this seems obviously to contradict omnibenevolence.
No, that's not true. Again, you can have invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance is not a reason for sending somebody to hell.
But I guess that the theists could somehow define eternal torture as good. They could, say that if God does it, then it's just necessarily good.
Well, it's good because it's, in the order of justice. Like, we're not going to say that, sending prisoners to prison is bad, right? No, that's a good thing. It's bad. I mean, it's bad in the sense that, prisoners don't want to go to prison, but it's good in the sense that, it's ordering society, it's preventing people from doing crimes. Like, it's a motive for people not to do crimes. And it's justice. It's a restoring of justice. That's what hell is. Okay. And I know that's hard for people who just think that, all we need is, prisons to be like this rehabilitation thing. There's more to it than that. Like, we also need to encourage people not to commit crimes. And that's part of what hell does. It's like, it's a It's a motive for people not to sin, which is a real problem for atheism, because under atheism, you could potentially murder and rob and, rape and do all these evil things and get away with it. And, there would be no kind of consequences. And yeah, I know most atheists probably wouldn't want to do that. They would have an emotional reaction, but some wouldn't. And so what do you do with those people? Do you just say that, oh, well, I guess it's good for them, but we just have to throw them in prison for our sakes? That does not seem like morality, right? Morality at that point just becomes, subjective, because rape and murder and stuff can become good for certain people. But also it becomes oppressive, because it's the will of the people enforcing their personal desires on others. And so it's just the same thing as, like, people complain about people oppressing homosexuals because what they view that as sinful. Well, that would be what all laws are, right? If morality is subjective. All laws would just be, those people who feel like this is immoral, the majority who feel like this murder, be it rape, be it whatever, the majority who feel that's immoral is forcing their wills on others, right? And so there's no reason why, if the majority feels that homosexuality is wrong, if the majority feels that anything is wrong, like, take something that I think is actually good, like having a family, right? If the majority thinks that having a family is wrong, then they simply enforce their will and oppress these people, and that's supposed to be how we're supposed to run society. That does not seem good. That doesn't seem right.
Since God is perfect, his action was perfect.
That answers the question, why did God create us?
Except it doesn't. Answering the question would involve, at the bare minimum, actually unpacking why the question is of concern. That way, Got Questions flock would actually understand why the question is pressing. They'd understand why answering the question of why God didn't create us as gods is a red herring. What's more, if Got Questions is going to insist that God created us for his pleasure, then they're going to have to expand upon what they mean by pleasure, since they can't mean pleasure in the general sense of the word, that is, a feeling of happy satisfaction or enjoyment, since per God's aseity, he's already perfectly happy, he's perfectly satisfied. But Got Questions didn't do this. So, why did God create? Well, one thing's for sure, Got Questions ain't got answers. So what we're left with is an absolutely independent, self-sufficient being creating for evidently no reason, despite the fact that in doing so he ensured the infinite suffering upon his children, rendering his omnibenevolence mute. But of course, we can get round his omnibenevolence friction by simply insisting that whatever God does, it's good. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special...
All right, well, I agree with part of his criticism, again, of Got Questions. Yeah, we can't gain anything, and saying that God does it for his pleasure sounds like God is sort of like gaining something. That said, I think I've sufficiently answered the question. It's pretty easy. God creates things for himself. And once you get rid of this egotistical view of reality where everybody just does things, for their own benefit, and nobody acts out of a free act of love, then this entire problem dissipates. So yeah, that's that. There's one more thing I wanted to do. So somebody asked, hold on a second. Somebody asked me a good question. And I'm going to go through these different questions here. Somebody asked me, am I going to respond to more majesty of reason? Okay. Well, today's your lucky day because I do want to respond to one thing. Now, in general, majesty of reason and I have gone back and forth, and it's just kind of, at this point, it's kind of exhausting because he produces videos that are like 4 to 6 hours long, and I simply don't have the time to go through all of that. And plus, his videos tend to be more sophisticated than rationality rules videos. So I'd like to, do a formal response rather than a live stream. So that takes time. That said, rationality rules and majesty of reason recently did a collab, and it was on why don't things pop into existence without a cause. And so I don't want to misrepresent what's going on here, but this is how I see it. Basically, instead of a causal principle, they introduced these two other principles, which are the transfer principle and the change principle. And you can watch the video for yourself. And I just wanted to comment on this, that the issue I have with this is that it seems that what they're missing here is that, okay, sure, you can propose these different principles to explain why certain things come into existence, and that's basically what these principles are supposed to explain. They're trying to explain, well, why doesn't a bicycle just come into existence from nothing, right? Why doesn't the famous William Lane Craig thing? If the principle of causality isn't true, why don't we just have bicycles popping into existence? Why don't we just have chaos going on? And they propose these two different principles as an alternative explanation, which is fine, but I think it really misses the point, because at this point, I could just ask the question, okay, why these principles rather than some others? Or why do these principles exist rather than others? These principles, unless they're metaphysically necessary, right? You haven't actually explained it, because I could say, well, why doesn't the change principle just pop out of existence at some time, right? Why doesn't the transfer principle just pop out of existence? And then at that point, if that happened, then we would just have the same problem where bicycles are popping in and out of existence. So, right, at that point, it just doesn't seem, it seems like he just pushed the question back a stage. And unless we get to something which is it just exists in virtue of itself, right? Something just metaphysically necessary, this is not going to actually solve the problem. And what is it that exists in virtue of itself? Well, it's something that just is existence. So unless you get to God, you're not actually solving this problem. So theism is still ultimately the result. And they might object that, well, okay, but the causal principle, why is the causal principle true? It's just as subjective as the transfer principle, except, many authors such as Father Gary Gould-Lagrange, Scott Sullivan, they have argued that the principle of causality, or the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, right? These principles actually come or derive from being. Specifically, they argue it comes from being in the sense that it comes from the principle of identity. Because you have to have something in virtue of which to distinguish one being from another, or something from non-existence, right? And I have a video on this, on the principle of causality. You can watch that video. But the point is, principle of causality, the principle of sufficient reason, the argument that we make, and you can argue it's unsuccessful, but the argument we make is that it's ultimately derived from being itself. And that's why it's necessary, because it's simply a description of what being itself is, with respect to, like, being is being, existence is existence, the principle of identity. And like I said, you can disagree with that, you can argue against it, but if you're going to introduce alternative principles to the principle of causality, I think what you're going to need to do is connect that to being itself and why it's true due to being itself. All right, so I'm going to go back and answer some more comments. And let's see here. All right. So, how does God enjoy creation, specifically considering he cannot be made perfect, more perfect, or have anything added to him? I basically agree with this. I mean, in a sense, you can say he enjoys creation in the sense that he loves himself, right? And creation is a perfect similitude, or well, not perfect similitude, but it's a similitude of himself. So there's something similar inside of creatures, since due to the principle of proportionate causality, right? What's in the effect is also going to be in the cause, right? And so I've talked about this in my Proving Christianity video. You're going to have some reflection of God inside of creation, and so God enjoying himself and loving himself, right? He can love creatures and enjoy creatures in enjoying and loving himself. Another analogy you might think about is, like, let's say that you just love chocolate itself, right? Well, in virtue of loving chocolate itself, you can also love things that are limited versions of chocolate, right? So, like, if you can love chocolate, which happens to be mixed in with some nuts, right? Even if you don't like nuts, right? You can love it insofar as you love chocolate. And so it's actually the love of chocolate itself, which is the ground for loving things that are chocolatey, right? And so in a similar way, God can love existence itself, and in virtue of loving existence itself, he can love things that exist, that participate in existence. And that can be like the ground for loving it, even though essentially primarily what he's loving is himself and loving existence itself. Kind of off topic, but it's similar, actually. Very similar. How do you respond to modal collapse objections? Did God freely create, or is creation necessitated by his nature? Well, I already explained that earlier. Like I said, the end is going to be the motive of action, and you're necessary, whether it's humans or God, the end is going to be necessarily willed. And so God necessarily wills himself, and we also necessarily will God. But there are multiple different ways of achieving our end, right? There's multiple different classes you can take in like they're called electives, right? In getting to your career. In loving God loving himself, there are multiple different creatures he can create, or he can refuse to create, right? And so the modal collapse objection basically just assumes that it's not even about freely creating per se. It's more about assuming that in order for God to create things, right, his nature has to be and it has to be in a certain orientation. So if God creates a world with hell, his nature has to be in certain orientation such that it creates hell, right? If God wants to create a world without hell, well, then his nature would have to be a certain orientation such as to create a world without hell. And so if you remove this variability inside of the nature, which would, since God can't change, he's not made of parts, all these sorts of things, there's no variability in his nature. Well, then basically the idea is that, well, then everything God creates is going to be necessary because God's nature is necessary. It doesn't change. It doesn't vary with possible worlds. Well, this is just an assumption, right? It's just an assumption that multiple effects cannot come out of a singular cause. Actually, let me let me go over to, I just want to explain this real quick. So let's erase all this. So the Thomistic view of causality, right? So they're going to have this view. Okay, so you have these beings. Let's say that you have a possible world with a triangle. Hard to draw a circle on here. Well, let's just make it a square, I guess. A triangle and a square. Well, they're gonna say in order for God to cause this, he has to have like a triangle state and a square state, right? And so this is like one possible world, right? This is God creating. This is like God's intentions here. And then we have, so let's say this is possible world 1. And then possible world 2, he, what he does is this. He has triangle again, but this time he has, what should I do? Well, let's just say double line. So in this possible world, God's intentional state is going to have to be like this. And so, possible world 1 is different from possible world 2, and also this requires different parts of God, right? I guess this should be a 2. Anyway. Okay. This is going to be different. This is not the way that the Thomistic view is. With respect to free will in general, not even just, God, with respect to free will in general, because this is actually going to ultimately be deterministic, right? Because it's determined based upon the intentional states. And you could always, now they could argue that, well, these are just kind of like arbitrary. They're just kind of, these intentional states, are arbitrarily caused by God. But in that case, you're just kind of go back a step, right? You're gonna have to have God back a step, causing these intentional states, and you're gonna have to say, oh wait a minute, God's gonna have to have another intentional, like an intentional state that caused the intentional state. And so you just get an infinite regress that way. But anyway, the Thomistic view would be more like this, where you have inside of God's intellect, and obviously this is going to be simple, but you have square, triangle, and you also have this. Whoops. The bars. And this is like in human intellect, God's intellect, or whatever. You're going to have that. And then the intentionality, this has a proportional actuality necessary to create an effect. But it doesn't necessarily have to actualize all of these. It could only actualize a partial, a part of the actuality of God, right? And in actualizing, right, so there's a ground in actuality, right? There's the proportion actuality to cause the effect, but the effect is not determined by the actuality within it. It could be this combination. It could be, a different combination. That part is free because, God has the ability to see all of these possibilities and then choose which ones he's going to actualize. So that doesn't lead to modal collapse. and it doesn't require changing God, because God, in the other possible world where he actualizes the other thing, he's going to be the same. Whoops. He's going to be the same way. Going to have the triangle, the square, and again, this is going to be one in God, and the bars, and then going to cause like that. God's the same, possible world's different. The modal collapse is not necessary. I think that's a pretty good response, honestly. It's just like they have a false assumption about how causality works. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Right, being is self-communicative. That is very important to this. What if someone doesn't think the idea of God is possible, and so doesn't do extensive research? I don't think I don't research flat Earth arguments because I don't find it plausible, and I don't get infinite ignorance. I suppose that's a possibility. Like I don't necessarily hold that everybody, like all atheists are vincibly ignorant. It's possible some are invincibly ignorant, I suppose. But where I would kind of be hesitant, though, there is this idea that we can kind of have an idea of God from our desires. Because like all people have this idea that they're seeking something. Like if you think about it, like it for a millisecond, right? You have to know that you're seeking something and choosing things. Now, maybe you don't realize that it's God, but you might implicitly believe in God by, for example, if you're seeking the good or if you're seeking truth, right? And so there can be a kind of implicit belief in God there. And it seems to me that like maybe there's some exceptions, but it seems like most people have this idea, right? Most people have this idea that there is truth, that we like, a lot of atheists are like, oh, well, I'm just trying to follow reason and I don't believe in God because it's not truthful, right? That in itself is like this idea of truth as their last end, as like the sort of like their motive for acting. Or if they say, if they want to be good people and they want to say, well, I'm a good person. Well, to say that you're a good person means that you're willing the good as your last end. That in itself can be a way of like believing in God. If you're willing the good as your last end, that plausibly could be infinite ignorance. I mean, that could be knowledge, implicit knowledge of God. I wouldn't say necessarily. I don't want to like say necessarily. I can't like read people's minds. But I'm just saying it's possible for somebody. It seems when you understand the possibility for implicit belief in God, it sounds a lot more plausible that actually a lot of, if not everybody, many, many, many atheists are either believers in God and don't know it, or they're they're vincibly ignorant of God, and meaning that they could change their state of ignorance. I don't fully understand invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance just means that a reasonable person doing their due diligence could not discover that God exists, right? Or any kind of moral thing, right? Like if you're not, there's some complicated situation. Let's say, the trolley problem, right? And you don't know how to solve the trolley problem, and you don't really have, you know, you haven't had time to think about it, and you're just there, and you have to decide, do you flip the switch or not? And you're plausibly invincibly ignorant there, right? Because you didn't really have you don't have time to study the topic before you make the decision, and you know, plausibly you didn't really have an obligation to study that specific situation prior to. You had no reason to ever believe you were in that situation. And so if you make the wrong choice, you could be invincibly ignorant, right? Okay, what if someone finds the idea of God plausible or not in contradiction with reality, but under Occam's razor, they don't research the idea anymore? Then I'd research whether Russell's teapot exists. Again, I think it's going to be the same answer as before. There. Again, if you have a reasonable reason not to researching in God, then that's okay, I guess. But it doesn't really take that much effort, honestly. I mean, it does take effort, but like if you watch one of my videos, for example, that's like 15 minutes of your time. Is that really too much to ask? Or reading one of Edward Fazer's 5 Proofs, right? Is that too much to ask, really? Especially like in the information age, right? I mean, you can stop watching porn for like one moment and read a book. And that might not convince you, but look, like I said, there's a few things, not only that, there's plausibly reasons to believe just simply, right, because you're seeking truth, because you're seeking the good, but also like 90% of people on Earth, well, I don't know how much but it's a very high percentage. Maybe it's more like 70%, but a lot of people believe in God, right? A lot of people do. A lot of experts do. 70% of philosophers of religion believe in God. There's plausible reason to think that, well, God could exist. The only reason, the main reason I see people say that they don't think God exists, or like it's not even something worth researching, right, is because they're like, oh, well, it's supernatural and supernatural bad. That's not a reasonable position. Supernatural bad, supernatural dumb, supernatural. That's just feelings. Okay, you're indoctrinated in a culture that has a negative bias towards magic, right? And theism, if you actually understand it, it's not magic. It's metaphysics, which is totally different. But that to say, so many people believe in God. So many experts believe in God. I don't see how you could rationally come to the conclusion that it's not even something worth studying. It would be kind of like a young Earth creationist being like, well, I know most scientists believe in evolution, but I don't think it's even worth studying. It's obviously false. It's it's not worth researching. That doesn't sound plausibly true. Okay, I mean, regardless of what you think about evolution, just saying that, well, it's obviously false because it seems false to me, I don't think that's really sufficient. And I would say the same thing about God. Anyway, I think that's all that we got here. Thanks everybody for sending in their questions and for watching. We'll own another atheist next time. Bye.